that most of the global media tended to limit themselves to the usual topics, your politics, corruption, poverty, and famine. So there was very little in terms of diversity. I think the biggest score on diversity of topics was the Guardian, the UK Guardian newspaper, which scored a 57%. So what that shows is that most global media still focus or concentrate on the usual topics that previous research has shown that global media focus on in terms of negative topics about Africa. Similarly, diversity of voices produce more or less similar results. Most of the stories cite males, in some cases white males, politicians, explaining the entire story. So it's the story of Africa is a story told predominantly by men and men in positions of authority. The other finding is that there was very little diversity in terms of African countries. So I think the highest score is just about 50% from AFP. So most global media organizations only concentrate on a limited set of African countries that they cover. In terms of the last score on depth of coverage, interestingly, we found that there is substantial depth in coverage. In fact, I think most of the organizations scored over 75%, which is quite encouraging because it seems to me and the research team that maybe after years of complaints that the coverage of Africa tended to be very sort of limited in terms of depth and superficial, et cetera, the journalists may have learned that it's important to provide context in coverage. It's important to provide depth and balance in coverage. So basically, those are some of the findings that we came up with. There is quite a lot of work that needs to happen, but there's also some interesting insights especially in terms of the depth of coverage. The report is available in both of the main report, which is in depth, but also I think the abridged report, as I think Africa No Filter colleagues can tell you. But I think that's pretty much what I can share with you for now, and I'll be happy to share other sort of if there are any questions, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks a lot, Christine. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Wallace. Thank you for that high-level summary. I can see some questions in the Q&A, so I just want to direct our attention there. If you do have a question for the panelists or a comment, a reflection on what you're hearing, drop it in the Q&A, and we'll have some time to answer the questions. But I'd just like to request our colleagues at Africa No Filter, if they can perhaps drop in the chat the link to the report or the executive summary of the report. I think that would be great. I also like to say that even if we are hosted today by Africa No Filter, they were not the only organization that worked on this index. It was a joint project between ANF, Africa No Filter, the Africa Center, and the University of Cape Town. So it took a lot of people in these different organizations to make this possible. And it's important that we recognize that. Again, I'd like to repeat the hashtags, hashtag Global Media Index, and also hashtag GMI for Africa, and that's 4 as the numeral 4. So that's GMI for Africa. All right, Lerato, thank you for the link to the report. If you'd like to scan the high-level findings, you'll see them when you click that link. You don't have to go too deep. You'll be able to see just high-level what we're talking about. So I'd like to start our panel discussion now, our substantive discussion in unpacking of the findings of this report. Professor Chuma, I just have a follow-up report on what you've just presented, and you will be our first speaker on the panel. The report actually has this index methodology that you've described: diversity of sources, diversity of topics, number of countries covered, and the depth of coverage. And you've mentioned The Guardian as topping the index. This index actually scanned 20 media outlets and 1,000 news pieces in total. So that's a ton of data. My question is, what specifically do you think contributed to The Guardian topping this index? What did you see in their coverage that that made them stand out in this particular way? Because every time you have a ranking, it's only natural for us as human beings to want to know what made number one be number one, right?
Yes.
Over to you. Mhm.
Thanks a lot, Christine. I think for The Guardian, it was mostly on two scores. The first was the diversity of stories. I mean, we found that they went beyond just the 5 mostly covered stories. We had a ranking of up to 27 different topics, and The Guardian literally ticked most of them. So they scored very highly on the diversity of topics, but also the diversity of voices. Of all the news media looked at, the Guardian had more women voices than all of them. So they also had a high score on that. But beyond that, they also had a high score on the diversity of voices, not by gender, but also by like location in the broader scheme of things, like citizens, ordinary people, sort of non-politicians, non-elites. So they did very well on that. They also did very well on the diversity of countries. I think they, I think in addition to AFP, I think they were like one of the top 3 who had stories covered from sort of more African countries than the rest of the pack. Yeah. So just before so what happened was that we ranked scores on each of the indicators, which then came up with the final score out of the 4. Yeah.
Right. And you'll see that when you look at the report, how the 4 indicators stacked up to actually reflect the ranking. Thank you so much for that, Professor Chuma. I'd like to now turn the mic over to Neha. You're a working journalist who has corresponded to different topics and whose work has been published extensively by various news outlets, including some of the ones mentioned here. Did any of the findings in this report surprise you?
Yeah, so I wish that they had, but unfortunately, I thought that this report did an excellent job encapsulating the state of global news coverage of Africa. I have worked with a number of the outlets that were examined in the study, including the bottom 3 in this case, as well as The Guardian and others. And, there were a couple things that stood out to me that I just wanted to talk about. I think I mostly work with US outlets, and I find that every time I work freelance, so I pitch every story that I do. It's like, you have to sell every idea to your editor. And I find that every time I pitch a story, I have to work really, really hard to convince my editor that it is worth the space and the money when they have limited space and limited budgets. So for an example, I was in Chad recently covering the refugee crisis along the border. And, this is a huge story. This is a massive migration crisis. It is a bloody war that is, obviously ethnically motivated. And, the humanitarian crisis is huge. And I had to really convince the people that ended up taking the stories that these stories were worth taking. And my editors, I will say my editors and producers, they want to do this, but they also have their hands tied with limited space and limited coverage. But of course, in the end, these are all decisions that people are making, right? So given what happened, I was actually supposed to go to Chad back in October, just at the time that the Hamas attacks occurred in Israel. And that was the kind of first time that the trip was postponed. It was then postponed another 3 times before ultimately I was able to get there in April. And these stories are now coming out. So with the war in Russia, with the war in Ukraine, and the war in Gaza, even something as big as the crisis in Sudan, we have to fight for coverage. My experience working with US outlets is editors want every story to have a US angle. So somehow this needs to connect to an American audience. I found that with UK publications, it's a little bit better. Oftentimes places like The Guardian, for example, will do a story because it's newsworthy, not because it relates to their British audience or their global audience. But in the case of American outlets, I do find that we need to, as a writer, I need to make that argument that, oh, this actually affects the demographic of people that I'm writing for. So During, for example, the Trump administration, I found that any story that had Trump in the headline, any pitch, was far more likely to be accepted than other stories. And that's kind of an unfortunate reality. But it's hard to convince a publication to publish a story about an issue in Africa, no matter where in Africa, just on the basis that it's got news value, as opposed to being a story that relates to Americanism in some way. As we discussed, this also extends to the topics that are covered. So stories about, war, migration, famine, and disease are relevant because they somehow tangentially connect to American policy. If there's a conflict, it spurs migration, which then affects the borders in Europe and the US. And so that feels relevant to people as opposed to stories about arts and culture or fashion or sport. And for me, some of the most fun stories that I've ever done as a reporter are things that are totally random and just cool, like stories about wildlife, stories about graffiti artists in Nairobi, or musicians in Sudan. I mean, those are the stories that I have the most fun doing. And what's funny is those are also some of the stories that I've gotten the best feedback on. So readers and viewers like that content, and they're interested in stories that are happy and that are interesting and that are cool. And yet that's not what editors are necessarily commissioning. And just one final note on the countries that are covered and diversity of sources. I think with countries that are covered, it's the same thing. I mean, when I'm pitching stories about Kenya, Nigeria, or South Africa, they're far more likely to be accepted more easily than if I'm pitching a story about the Seychelles, or if I'm pitching a story about Eswatini. So that aligns very much with Professor Chuma and his team's findings. And then finally, with lack of diversity of sources, this, I think, is something that we can attribute to the reporters themselves rather than the editors and the decision makers sitting in the newsrooms in DC or New York or London. I think it takes an extra half step to make sure that you are including sources who represent a diversity of opinion and life experience. There are plenty of white male experts on Kenyan economics, but there are also plenty of female Kenyan economists. So you really just need to find that person. And I think people who are not doing that are just kind of doing lazy reporting.
Neha, thank you so much for those important insights, very concise. And what you're alluding to, maybe I can just say it explicitly, and for those who are reading the index, they'll see this immediately, that on the overall rankings, American outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal actually score at the bottom of the index. And what you've attributed that to is the editors saying, like, oh, why would an American want to read this? Instead of having the perspective that this is newsworthy, this is a story, right? Which is actually in conversation with my question for Nicholas from the Africa report. So part of what is quoted in the report in some background is that some research shows that foreign correspondents in Africa write their news with the following Western audiences in mind: the grandma, the tourist, the businessman, the political elite. TAR has correspondents all around the continent. I'm just wondering how you see your audience. Are there overlaps with the audiences that I've just mentioned? Do you see it differently? And the Africa report was not part of this index, but how do you see where you sit and who your stories are directed?
Thanks, Christine, and hi, everyone. I apologize, there's some building work happening near me. You're right, we're not part of this study. I'm not sure if it's a compliment or not. Perhaps we are seen as being fully African. We do have African ownership. We're owned by a Tunisian family, so to an extent that's true, but our headquarters is in Paris, so to an extent that's not true. We are, however, a very small team here, and as you say, we have 40 correspondents on the continent. If we can just keep this confidential between us and not tell it any of the people who employ me, I really don't think of the audience first when we're commissioning story. We're in a country, it's a story on Nigeria. it's about, is this important in Nigeria? If you look at the anatomy of power in Nigeria, does this count? Does this matter? Is it a structurally important company that we're talking about, employs tens of thousands of people, or has a real impact on livelihood? So that's really what our prism is. Does it matter for the people in this country or in this region? There might be a minister in power in Abuja, and he's also financing the opposition. So how does Nigeria have a functioning opposition? It doesn't. That's a problem for governments. That matters for Nigerians, and that's the kind of thing that we'll really focus on. It doesn't mean we don't care about the audience. I mean, I really like seeing on Google Analytics, we'll post a story on politics in Kinshasa, and the president and the former president are taking chunks out of each other. Nairobi is fascinating. Our audience in Nairobi is really plugged into what's happening in the DRC, and I mean, we'll get to the diversity piece later, but I think that's a really interesting way of looking at audience. Where are they sitting? And of course, we care about audiences sitting in the US because there's a huge African diaspora who read our stories, and so we post something on Ethiopia and everything goes crazy, and likewise Nigeria, again, very, very big Nigerian diaspora in the US. But yeah, I think the prism has to be, does this matter for the people in the country where you're writing?
I'll start pitching to you, Nicholas.
Please do.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like now to hand the mic over to Beauregard Tom. You're an investigative journalist with many years of experience, including the Africa editor for OCCRP, which focuses on organized crime and corruption. In your many years, have you come across an instance where an investigative journalism story has successfully challenged stereotypes, or maybe even provided deeper insight into African issues in a way that global media overlooks?
Thanks for the question, Christine. So, yeah, there's a number of stories that I would point to, and it isn't a huge change. It's the perspective that I think is important, because the examples I'd like to point to are stories told by Africans for Africans, and that is what's important, And so one of the things I'd like to point out is that the level of competency is exceptionally high, and that is demonstrated in many of these stories. You look at the stories that were done, for instance, Tom Odula's story, that he did with the exploitation of women workers on tea plantations. That was a great story, and it was told with empathy and not sympathy. And this is a very important distinction, I think. Sometimes I think in television, they have these things called Johnnies. So they are sound bites, people, oh, and we need somebody to say this, and they just say the words and okay, that fills that gap. No, you must recognize that they are real people here. And it comes back to what Africa No Filter talks about, which is about that agency. So what we're seeing in investigative journalism in Africa is a larger ownership of the story by Africans, and a greater degree of agency shown to the people who are being reported on. I'm old enough to know that many of my colleagues, we were taught to kind of mimic what the BBC did or Reuters did or AFP, etc. And so and that is always difficult, but I think there's been a decided shift in that, where there's a greater sense of ownership. So I'll point to that story by Tom Odula. I think the work that the likes of Yusra El-Bagir did in Sudan, she works for Sky News, and we've spoken about Neha, I'm sure is very familiar with this. In Sudan, it's overlooked. People can't get access, but I mean, people also can't get access to Gaza, but we talk about that, So, the work that she did, making it a very personal story, making us see the people there, that even if we don't wholly understand the conflict or the war that's taking place there, that is critical work and that I think is indicative of, is important to show that kind of power that African journalists hold, especially when they're working for foreign media institutions like Sky, which doesn't really do much on Africa. I mean, I don't look to them when I'm thinking about Africa reporting. Then I'd also speak to a collective in the Gambia. You look at the radio news journalists. Again, they are not synonymous with investigative journalism, but there was a big expose done about how Yahya Jammeh went and exploited and stole or looted the Gambia essentially. That was built off the back of years and years of reporting by radio journalists. And in a small country like the Gambia, it's precarious work. So, you know, my hat's off to them for doing that kind of work. That chipping away at a story over many years, which we see being done by a group of journalists, which then effectively leads to change. You know, people think that it all comes down to one big boom. It almost never works like that in journalism. And then, of course, the innovation, which I'd like to point to. I think Africa Uncensored, I mean, look, they do fantastic work and they are one of the leaders on the continent. But if you look at the microsite that they built around, what they did was they plotted all the big exposés in Kenya over many, many years. And then they asked their audience to contribute to that. You know, people who might have been scared a decade, 2 decades ago to contribute information to a particular investigation. They are asking people, can you actually help us? Is there something new or something that you have somewhere buried in somewhere that you want to contribute? That I think is great. It's not wholly unique. They saw the idea from colleagues in South America, but they adapted it for their audience, which I think is very clever from Namo and his friends. Then, of course, the work by the continent, you know, again, distributing your news on WhatsApp, again, not unique, but the way they do it, I love that publication. I think they also find a way to make it more palatable for us, where we have that criticism where journalism is often dour and people don't want to engage with it. I think they make it a lot more accessible for us, and I think that is great work. So look, there's a lot of things to be said here, and I'm trying to be brief, but I think the most important point I'll try to make is that when we are telling our stories as investigative journalists, I think what is important from what I'm seeing among African investigative journalists is that they, for the most part at least, are allowing people agency, that they see the people who they speak about. They are not just props in their stories, you know, so they understand what is important and, importantly, who is important.
Thank you so much, Beauregard. Thank you for those amazing examples. I'm familiar with most of the outlets and the work that you've mentioned. I'm a huge fan, and those are actually very powerful stories and great work that's happening around the continent. I'd like to hand the mic over to Abimbola. But before I do that, I'd just like to ask our colleagues at Africa No Filter. There's a lot of questions and requests coming in the Q&A. So if we can answer some of them, the ones that have more to do with whether this recording will be available later, where they can get the report. If you have questions specifically for the panelists, please do go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. If you tag or mention who the question is for, even better. All right. Abimbola, you're the advocacy and campaigns lead at Africa No Filter. How does the evidence presented in this index and the ideas explored in this report get us to better representation for Africa?
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. It's been, lovely just hearing from the people on the ground, the media people themselves, who are like the key people on this research. So thanks for the question. When you say better representation, just to give you a little clarity, for us, it's our theory of change. It's our strategy to get, the world to know that better stories can be told about the continent, and that leads to, a positive narrative shift on behalf of Africa. So having produced a project, a research like this in partnership with the Africa Center and the University of Cape Town is huge for us, because it not only gives us the platform to say, we've been talking about stereotypes for a long time, but now here's a mirror. There is evidence for people to actually see and take note of when they say, oh, the way that Africa is covered, there's a problem with status quo and things like that. So for us, the first step is that it's a conversation starter with the media people themselves. The fact that we're having this panel discussion is proof of that. Conversations are starting on different platforms with the media and with people who listen to the media as well, the consumers of stories. But more concretely, it's very beneficial in the sense that now we are seeing concrete steps that people can take. Some of the findings from the research is just how many African countries are covered. So we're hoping that media organizations can go onto the index and say, oh, wow, how well did we do? We covered 12 of 54 countries. Now a concrete thing to do is expand the number of countries you cover, or the voices that shine the most are, powerful men. Now something to do is include the voices of the marginalized, include the voices of people who do not usually feature. Or in terms of the topics, we tend to focus on, hard news, on violence, on conflict, on drought, on famine. Meanwhile, there's a lot of, stories to be covered in fashion, lifestyle, food, things that contribute to that wholesome identity, of the continent. So we are proud to put this out because now there's things to read in between the lines. And if you look in the recommendations part of the report as well, you will see that we are calling on people to not only see it as a punitive thing. It's not a report card that is supposed to make you sad. It's a mirror to help you assess where you are, because we recognize the media as great, change agents. They are the drivers. They are the representatives of the continent, so to say. So we see it as a tool to equip them to say, if we were to commit resources to doing things differently, what are the clear, actionable next steps that we can take? And we think the research report has done a fantastic job, of that.
Thank you so much for that, Abimbola. I see some questions coming in the Q&A, and Susan Davis asked if we know of any African speakers, bureaus, or databases or lists of experts available to global media. And she says that often foreign experts are the ones who are quoted and interviewed after something big happens in Africa. I can share one that I know. It's called Quote This Woman. And if you just Google them, you'll see the database that they have. They have a database of African women experts who, as Professor Chuma said, having women as experts and voices in stories is something that a lot of media publications need to improve on, including Africa-based. And so if any of the panelists know of databases or lists that you are aware of, it would be nice to share. But now I would like to ask Neha another question. How do you think the findings of this report influence your future reporting, your work in the future? You've mentioned that a lot of what came up actually did not surprise you. But what are you going to do with the findings of this report on a personal level?
Yeah, so I think there were two things that came to mind here. The first is probably the more practical, which is looking at this scorecard of the foreign media outlets and how they've done. It helps guide me in where I might be able to pitch. Of course, not including the places that are not listed, OCCRP being one of them. But, looking at these different media organizations and saying, well, why necessarily pitch to the bottom half of the list when I know that a place like, for example, The Guardian might be far more receptive to the kinds of stories that I want to do. So it can certainly help me in guiding my pitches, especially depending on what the topic of the story is. But I think also it can give me a little bit of direction as, somebody freelance who does cover the continent, trying to see how much I can push the envelope and try to convince editors to take stories that are from, let's say, undercovered countries or on undercovered topics, making an argument for, this story in Lesotho might be very important, or, we should make sure that we do this, a story about Fashion Week and it's on the front page of a Vogue or a Wall Street Journal. Like, why is that not being covered in that way? And so, there's only so much influence that one freelance reporter can have, but I think continuing to pitch and knock at the door and knock at the door until it opens just a crack, and then, getting your foot in that door. And, as you develop good relationships with editors and do good work with editors, they're more receptive to a wider range of topics and story ideas. And so I think I would certainly use this as a guide to help me figure out how I might be able to do that. And, the last note in being expanding where I pitch and I write for is really helpful. Trying to write for more African-based, African-led media outlets could be something that I try to do in the future, based on the fact that I'm going to be able to get much better stories out in those publications.
I thank you for that, Neha. I'm the many hats that I wear. Of course, as Africans, we are doing multiple things at any one time. I'm still a working journalist, a freelance one. I've written for the Africa Report and for other publications. And Neha, I think your advice is really good. It opens up our minds on the kind of framings that we have and the kind of places that we look for stories. And for me, I think that's my number one takeaway from this. Nick, the report indicates a general lack of diversity in topics. That's something that has come out quite clearly. You have any advice for fellow editors or newsroom leaders on how they can improve their coverage to include more diverse stories, perspectives, and voices on Africa?
One of the things that I really fundamentally believe is missing is just plain vanilla corporate coverage. And it sounds very boring, but Mo Ibrahim has been banging on about it for many years. He says you take a big corporate in India, it gets 10, 20 times as many column inches as the same size company on the continent, which is absolutely ridiculous. And we complain, and we're right to, about the risk premium that Africa pays on investment coming into the continent. A lot of it is due to the fact that people are blind. They're not quite sure what they might be investing in. We need a lot of very boring but very important vanilla corporate coverage. So I'd plead for that, and we try and do as much as we can on the Africa Report. Something else which I find works quite well is profiles of up-and-coming stars. Could be culture, could be politics, could be business. People who can connect between the generations who are currently in power and the youth. Those people are fascinating, and they're going to be in charge tomorrow. So everyone can see the point of it, as it were. And I guess because they're young, they haven't done anything too awful yet. So they're generally positive stories. And then also, I'd like to be a little bit contrarian and push back a little bit on the premise of the question, if I might, Christine.
Go ahead.
Because
Go ahead, Nicholas.
I'm going to do it anyway. Is it my role as a journalist to provide positive and diverse stories, or is it my role to alert the public to something which might be problematic? I really love this analogy of the immune system of the human body, where there's a class of white blood cell, and it alerts when there's a pathogen or something that needs to be recognized by the immune system, and then other bits of the immune system swing into action and either get rid of it or process it or whatever it might be. And in an ideal world, the media sometimes would blow the whistle, and then the police and the judicial system would swing into action. So isn't that also an important role for the media, along with perhaps some of these other more positive and representational roles? I would find it very difficult to reprimand the great South African journalists who hammered away at those who were involved in state capture in South Africa, and quite successfully, I would argue. So I think that is possibly a counterpoint. But I do think there's a role to be played in.
Before you, Nick,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, very sorry, because I really want Abimbola to respond to that. I can see it in her eyes, and this is the moment for her to respond. What would you say to Nick pushing back on the framing of what we're discussing?
I wish my face wasn't so telling. Unfortunately, if I'm thinking something, it shows on my face and I cannot stop it. Thanks, Nick, for that very contrarian view. And I think we hear it a lot. And I think it just boils down to what the media and the society define as a newsworthy moment. The constant thing we know, what we hear is if it bleeds, it leads. And it feels as though it's a vicious cycle where the media has programmed the society has programmed the media to believe that if it's not hard news, we don't want to hear it. And I think that's why we come in. That's why we're doing so much advocacy on the premise that there's actually lots of demand for positive news. A lot of people are fatigued by, the hard, if it bleeds, it leads. That's not the only thing I want to hear about, both on the continent and in the diaspora. So solutions journalism is on the rise. People are starting to realize that not only do I want to hear about the problems, I also want to know that there is a way out. The audience, people want good news. People are turning to social media to hear. These days, if you want to avoid depression, you avoid CNN, you avoid BBC, you avoid the really big ones. You go on TikTok because they will let you know what is happening without bringing, the negativity to it. So my take to what Nicholas said is, while I understand that that's status quo, we do need to be aware of the new dynamics that are emerging. It's no longer if it bleeds, it leads. There is room for solutions journalism, and there is so much benefits to gain from doing things differently, which is why we're trying to provide evidence, such as the Global Media Index for Africa, to show people that, well, if you continue the way you are doing, you keep getting the same results. But if you turn this way, look how much more, better results you can get. So that is my quick and political, non-abrasive response to Nick's take.
Neha, as I see your hand up, and I'm going to let you follow up
I just
on what
wanted to
on what you're hearing.
jump in on this one too. So, I mean, I also find, especially with the outlets I report for, that the majority of my stories are generally quite depressing. And my mom complains about it, for example. But I do think that one of the ways that we could look at this is just by comparing the coverage that happens in Africa with what happens across other continents as a way of determining whether we're covering too much doom and gloom or whether we're doing a good job of balancing. I would say overall around the world, net negative is the way that media coverage skews, right? It is meant to tell truth, speak truth to power. It is meant to show people what is happening in, bad situations. It is meant to uncover and investigate things that are wrong in order to try to get the people who need to make them right. That's my view as a sort of advocacy journalist in that sense. But, are we doing more negative reporting on the continent than what you might see in Europe or Asia? Or does it feel like we have the same balance as others? And I think what I've found with my pitching process is that I have a very difficult time getting any kind of positive story covered, and being able to pitch those stories to, foreign media. And I think I do see some, I see stories coming out of India, for example, or out of Italy or out of Mexico that are fun and happy, as well as all of the negative stuff coming out. So that's where I would say, looking at other continents and getting a sense of where do we rank here, and does it seem that coming out of Africa, it's all negative, whereas coming out of other places, it's 15% to 85%. And that's where we might be able to kind of measure up and see if we're skewing in one particular direction.
Neha, you've mentioned that, and the report actually does speak to that question. Is it that journalism generally skews negative, or is it that Africa as a topic, as a broad topic, definitely skews more negative, right? I think the appendix of the report actually does explore that, contrasting what we are seeing in the report with other findings from South America and Asia, and other places. I want to bring you back in, Beauregard. In light of what Neha has just mentioned about, and Nicholas as well, about a lot of investigative journalism is doing the work of white blood cells, right? In the framing that Nick had. which the body needs. If you don't have white blood cells, you are not going to live long, right? But then if you have too many spiraling out of control, you have leukemia, and you're also not going to live a healthy life. So my question is, as an investigative journalist, and in light with the findings of this report, where do you see the future for the kind of important work that investigative journalism does to create a better future for African people, but at the same time with a level of what you mentioned earlier, for example, in the Tom Udula story, it was a very difficult, hard story that was told in a very sensitive way, for example.
Mhm. So I think the future is quite, I mean, journalism overall specifically, we speak about the media, but of course we do journalism in the media. And journalism overall has been in peril for a long time. I think things are looking better for investigative journalism for now, because it is largely dependent on funding. And there's a lot of money going towards investigative journalism right now. And we're seeing a lot of one thing that encourages me is that we see a lot of journalists in Africa setting up independent investigative units to hold power to account, of course, and many of them have been quite successful in this. We're seeing deeper collaboration happening between colleagues across borders. When we hold the AIJC, for instance, people are always walking away from there with stories, with projects that they want to pursue, and they're very effective. And so what they're leading with is the kind of stories which they feel are important for their audience, much like the so-called international media. And so what they think is important for their audience, so they are taking ownership, right? And that is great. They're not thinking, oh, I wonder what the New York Times would like from us today. No, they're saying, I know what I think this is an important story for my audience, and I'm gonna tell the story, and I've got these connections, and we're seeing a greater ability and flexibility among colleagues. The integration of data into investigative journalism, the integration of advocacy work in there, the integration more recently of AI into this kind of work. So I think that as far as the future goes, I think it's bright.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question in the Q&A, which I will direct to Professor Chuma. Wallace, I know that this media index focused on what I would say the international publications, right? The New York Times of this world, and Xinhua and Russia Today and the rest. But you are a researcher, a scholar, and an expert on African media. And even if this report did not focus on African media, the question in the Q&A asks, even if we're showcasing how international media perceives Africa, what about how African news outlets position and perceive Africa? Maybe that's something that this report did not speak to directly, but you could have some insights on. Are African media owners, editors, and journalists just using the same exact framings and tropes, or is there something to highlight there?
Thanks a lot, Christine. Research shows that the difference is not great. Most mainstream media in Africa tend to also cover Africa in the same way that global media cover Africa, to a large extent because of the history, the colonial history of African media. The African media, all their historical background to Africa's encounter with Europe through colonialism. So most of if you look at the training of journalists in Africa, the curriculum is still predominantly Western. So the same professional tenets in terms of training still apply. So I am aware of the fact that Africa No Filter did a project previously, which focused on African journalists. I'm not sure if Abimbola could speak to that, but African media tend to basically replicate the frames that that are part of global media's framing of Africa. There isn't much difference. That's from a research perspective. Yeah. There could be difference in terms of nuance, et cetera, but there is generally that sort of negative framing, and they focus on the, so the dramatic, the negative, et cetera, et cetera. So it may be a difference of degree, but certainly not in kind. Yeah, thanks.
I think I'll jump in with just a follow-up on that, Professor Chuma. I have a friend, he is associate professor at NYU. His name is Professor Siguru Wahutu, and he actually conducted a study on this exact question: how different are African media? And his research turns out that not that different. And here's what really struck me about his book. He said that African media, talking about journalists and editors, actually consider Western media as good journalism. So they consider it as aspirational. In order to be a great journalist, we need to do things like the New York Times, right? And so they actually create this hierarchy in their minds that good journalism equals X. And that's how they kind of get trapped in replicating the same frames, even if they're aware, very aware of the bigger narratives that Abimbola was talking about earlier, and how these framings actually have big real life consequences, and also they're even aware of what one of the participants here, Maria, says in the chat, that I think I'll just quote her directly, that let me just get the chat. She said that media outlets are often too worried about whether their audiences will find a story relevant. They should also realize that they have the power to influence what people find relevant. And Professor Chuma, I think you'll agree with me that African-owned media outlets sometimes don't exercise that power, because they believe that the more they look like the New York Times, the more serious and professional they are.
Absolutely. Can I, so quickly, yes, you're absolutely right, Christine. And yes, we have a mutual friend in Wahutu, so someone I work with in several projects. The tendency basically is that African media have looked at the Western media as a gold standard in terms of the reporting. Even in terms of, have you noticed that every little scandal that African media, not all, break, it's called, there's a get someone after the what we call that Nixon
Watergate equals
Watergate. After Watergate,
Nkandla-gate equals.
So those very
Yeah.
small things are indicators of the extent to which we look as African journalists at the West as the sort of standard, the gold standard for the work that we do. Thanks.
I see two hands up. Oh dear, oh dear. Beauregard, I'll let you go first.
I must defer to Nicholas. His hand was up first. I'll go after him if you don't mind.
Okay, all right. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Beauregard. You're a gentleman. I wanted to bring up this really interesting book called The Europeans, and it talks about how the national consciousness of several European countries is really traced back to the first creation of these national newspapers. Before, there wasn't really a sort of an English consciousness. Suddenly, there were train lines, there were these newspapers ferried around to all parts of the countries, and you started getting this national consciousness. And it was incredibly powerful in terms of what happened next, for better or for worse. But I do think the media plays a really important role in that. And I think it would help us move away from the, if it bleeds, it leads narratives. And we focus and help media houses focus on curating these national conversations. You talked about, Professor Chuma, you talked about the impact of the Europeans on Africa. How damaging was that for any kind of national consciousness? Not even going into the artificial nature of the ensuing nations. When I go to an exhibition in an art gallery in Lagos, and they're hanging paintings from a northern Nigerian on the walls, and suddenly they're talking, and suddenly that dialogue spills out into the sort of opinion pages of some of the very good Nigerian newspapers, I think, wow, this is really constructive. You know, people in the South saying, actually, I didn't really know how bad they had it up in the North. You know, these things which are super important, which have got nothing to do with violence or bleeding and leading. I think that's a place we really need to try and focus our attention and bolster and shower with cash.
Beauregard, go ahead.
Yes, I just needed to push back against what I believe is an oversimplistic idea, which has been presented here by Prof. and what you cited from your colleague in some other university somewhere. So yes and no. Many journalists who I know, and I'm fortunate to know many journalists across our continent, yes, we do look at best examples, and many of them, yes, come from the Western world. But increasingly, we have forged our own narrative and we have looked to best examples from our own continent. And we cannot go and ignore that, please. The likes of what John Allen Namu is doing, the likes of what Nasa is doing, etc. They're doing fantastic work, and we look to them as examples more and more. And that is, I mean, if you go to talk about the African Investigative Journalism Conference, I mean, we have 120 speakers, of which 90% of them are Africans, presenting sterling examples of the best investigative journalism being done on our continent. So we can't just go and provide a simplistic narrative. Of course, we still feel the impact in a post-colonial Africa, and we will for some time. But I have seen the shift over, you know, my 25 years as a journalist in terms of how people no longer try to imitate our master's voice. And we actually try to tell our own story in our own voice. So please be cognizant of that.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to respond to a comment in the chat. Tondi says that this conversation is all well and good, but his question or her question is on the acceptance rates of publications like the Africa Report. How responsive are they to pitches from African freelancers based on the continent? Because most of the stories being published are not by Africans. I think I will let Nick respond to this, but in my experience, I think the Africa Report, the correspondents and contributors are overwhelmingly African. But Nick, you can go ahead and just comment on that.
Yeah, no, they are overwhelmingly African. I mean, we have just in Nigeria, a senior opinion writer, someone in Lagos, someone in Abuja, and a business-focused journalist in Nigeria. That's probably our biggest team. The other ones are smaller than that. And we have a lot of stuff which we translate from our sister publication, Jeune Afrique, about a third of our articles. And I mean, we didn't get to talk about the diversity piece, but I think geographic diversity, getting stuff on, you know, what's happening in Cameroon and Gabon, translated into other languages, accessible to more people on the continent and around the world, I think is super important. But on that narrow question of the Africa Report, yeah, most of the stuff we publish is written in Africa by Africans.
Thank you. Nick, Neha, I see your hand up. Over to you.
Yeah, so just one other thing that I wanted to bring up, or I think is important to think about in this discussion, is also the environment that we're operating in. So, you know, for me as a freelance reporter, there are a lot of African publications that I would love to write for. At the same time, I know that I will be paid more by foreign publications. And I live story to story. That's how I make my money. And so I think that's something that we want to think about, is continuing to funnel money into African media publications that are supporting African writers and African stories. And how can we do that as a community? I also think it's important to think about press freedom, right? It is some of this hard-hitting investigative journalism comes at a much higher cost in certain countries than it might in other countries. And you know, doing this kind of story in the United States, yes, there's media suppression everywhere, but I'm not worried that I'm going to be taken out. Whereas, you know, there are certain countries that are very challenging to report in and do come with a higher level of danger for the reporter and, for example, the reporter's family. So just thinking about how I think as we continue to try to change the narrative of the stories that are coming out and change who is telling those stories, and trying to have African publications be the ones creating the narrative about Africa and not, not deferring to or having to follow, Western media, which I don't think is the case. I don't think that's happening, but I think that ensuring that we have a strong supporting environment of good pay, civil society that's keeping an eye out on journalists and making sure that journalists are not intimidated, and other kinds of things like that, I think would also be really helpful in just continuing to promote the kind of journalism that we all want to see.
Kristen, we can't hear
Can't
you.
hear you.
Mm.
Now you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. I muted myself on my earphones, and in a moment like this, you use earphones every day, but now I can't fix it for now. Nick, I see your hand is still up. Do you have a follow-up?
No, it was
Okay.
misclick.
Okay, great. To the participants of this webinar, if you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A window. If you have comments, you can do that in the chat. Sometimes you just are reflecting on what you're hearing, or just responding to it somehow. But if you have specific questions, please do drop them in the Q&A, and we will direct, and if you can direct them to specific panelists, the better. So I have a question here that I will open up to the panel. If you feel you have a response, please do go ahead and answer it. What role, if any, has citizen journalism played in how African media outlets report about Africa? Or maybe even global one. Are global media outlets influenced by what they see citizen journalists doing, including on social media platforms like TikTok and Twitter and the rest? Anyone on the panel?
I can speak briefly to that. So I use citizen journalism as a primary source in a lot of my reporting. For example, everything that was going on in Kenya the last few weeks with the protests. I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't in the country. I'm normally based in Nairobi, but I happened to be out of the country, which was really frustrating. And I was relying entirely on citizen reporting. So people's firsthand photos, TikToks, Twitter. I did have journalists who were, I'm in some of the journalist chats, so I was following that as well, but it was really by identifying somebody who posted a video and then calling them and then interviewing them that I was able to get the kind of information that I needed. And that's just one small and recent example. I think also, for example, in Sudan, where access is extremely limited, the way that people are kind of being able to see what's actually happening in Darfur is through videos that people are taking as they flee. And that is, with the complete lack of access, and the level of violence going on, it's hard to believe it unless you see it. And some of those videos are horrifying. And it's those people, I think, who are getting the news out about, mass ethnic-based killings in an entire region that nobody would really know what that looks like unless they saw these videos from these brave individuals. So I think, especially in cases where access is limited, where, for example, Western media outlets won't allow their reporters to go, this kind of, from the global news perspective, I think this is absolutely invaluable. We could not report without them.
Anyone else on the panel who would like to speak to this? Well, I'd like to just read out a comment on the chat from Deng. He says, I'm not a journalist, but most African journalists in the past were reprogrammed to design the news to fit the narrative on where the resources are from and shaped by ownership. I'm very hopeful that that seems to be gradually changing. And even though it will take time, most journalists, most African journalists are well informed about African history. Thank you for that comment, Deng. Again, if you have any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A. And one more reminder on our hashtags, which are hashtag Global Media Index and hashtag GMI for Africa. And that's a numeral 4. Beauregard, I see your hand up. Go ahead and unmute.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on what Deng said. We must remember that in the history of Africa, and especially with our liberation movements, we had people who were media practitioners who felt that their journalism was part of that liberation. And so they were, people must not forget this history because it informs the journalism we see today. And then of course that changed over time so that we found certain media influencing or being essentially working for the will of their political masters or working for the will of business owners. And then we saw that all over Africa, and I still see it today. Sometimes when you find a proliferation of media, it's not really that. It's just some person with deep pockets who wants to make sure that their voice is heard and they want to influence things. We had it here in South Africa. I mean, the origin of newspapers here starts with mining groups. The guys like the Beers and the Oppenheimers, they started newspapers here, and it was to push their agenda. So let's be very clear on these things. So there's a long history to consider about these things, and it's important to note that. It's important to know who owns it, and it's important for media to be transparent about who is behind them and if they are serving an agenda or not.
Thank you for that reminder, and you're very right that information was invaluable and continues to be invaluable to political movements, consciousness, action, and all these things that actually do tangibly shape African societies. We are coming to the end of our time together. And before I wrap up, I'd like to draw your attention to the poll, the survey, that is going to be posted shortly. And again, feel free, we don't have to end things here. We can continue the conversation online. The post-webinar survey is up, so you'll see it in the polls window. You can go ahead and fill in your responses on how you felt in your experience of this webinar, but thank you so much for your attention. In today's attention economy, having folks, more than 100 attendees for a webinar like this is very, very encouraging, and I've been very glad to be steering the conversation. I still see some comments on the chat asking for folks at Africa No Filter to share the link for the recording, and I'm sure they will be doing so shortly. So my last question is directed to you, Abimbola. What next for the Global Media Index? This whole conversation was sparked and centered around those research findings. What happened? What comes next? And how do you plan to track and report progress in the future? I believe this is the first index of its kind. Is it going to be an annual thing? Is it one of those things that that folks can now start to put in plans in place to improve for the next one? What can audiences, outlets, and everyone who has come for this webinar and beyond, who is interested in these conversations, what can they look forward to next?
Wow, that's a huge question. And as you were asking, Wallace was almost jumping out of the screen to amplify the microphone, because as partners on this, I mean, that has been a question from the onset. At the start, we wanted this to be a recurrent, iterative process that serves over time as a credible mirror that anyone can go onto and find and say, you know what, if I want to see how global media covers Africa, I'm going to be doing it. But if you ask Wallace, he will tell you that this was no small feat. In between us three partners, it took a lot. It's a very resource-intensive project. And we do have hopes and plans to make this not a one-time thing. But unfortunately, right now, I'm not able to give, promises that watch out for this at so time next year. But rest assured, because we see the value that this has provided, and just from the buy-in and the feedback that we're getting from people, we do hope to commit, some form of regularity, to this index. Now, that being said, I just want to also reiterate that the purpose of this has yet to be established, in full. Before we even start making sure that maybe every year, hopefully, once there's funding and everything for that, there's a global media index. We also want to see how to push this to as many platforms as possible. There are rooms that conversations need to be had. This is just the first of many. There are different roles to be played by not just the citizens. And I'd love to see that a lot of comments are coming up around accountability, not just the media, but you as a citizen, as a consumer of the news. What can you do now that you know that there is something like this that exists? How can you join the conversation and start saying, oh yeah, it's true. I actually have a problem with the way this, that, or this is good. And how do you contribute to that? How do you plug into that? Who are the other people who contribute to how Africa is being seen? African leaders, for example, media regulatory bodies. What do they have to do to contribute to things going further? The general public, how can they, plug into the conversation as well? So it's a mirror not just for media, and we're very careful to, make sure that we're not pointing fingers at media at all, but, carrying them along in this conversation to say all hands need to be on deck. And for this first edition of the Global Media Index for Africa, while Professor Wallace's team at the UCT and, the Africa Center and Africa No Filter decides and pulls things together for the next, stage of this, how can we push to make sure that we juice out, the good things that can come from this first edition as much as possible? So, yeah, the hope is this becomes a regular thing, but in the meantime, there are still many next steps. There are many what next to do, which involves, raising this in as many rooms as possible and everyone recognizing the role they have to play and playing it. And I think a big part of that is, just contributing to this discourse on social media. Christine has shared the hashtag Global Media Index and GMI for Africa. If you see something, say something. If you think something, share it. As much as possible, we want people to be able to talk. Let's know. If you don't talk about it, there is no way anything will happen about it. So that's where, we currently are.
Abimbola, a wonderful place to end this discussion, which doesn't actually end here, but it continues. If, as Abimbola said, if you see something that actually reminds you of what you heard here, let's continue the conversation. Thank you to everyone who was able to be part of this conversation. So many rich comments coming in through the chat. If you haven't filled in the survey, please go ahead and do so now. But I'd like to thank my very, very worthy and insightful panelists, Professor Wallace Chuma, Beauregard Trump, Neha Wadekar, Nicholas Snowbrook, and Abimbola Omotola. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your energy and your insights on this panel. I have been your moderator and MC and guide and all-round coordinator of this conversation. My name is Christine Mungai. And a special thanks to the three organizations that put this insights together, and that's Africa No Filter, the Africa Center, and the University of Cape Town. You can feel free to jump off the call at your pleasure, as we say in Kenya. I have no idea why we say that. It's just like giving people permission to leave. For some reason, as Kenyans, we need to be let go. Like, tell me it's okay to leave, right? And so I officially give you permission. If you have any final comments, if you'd like to give us some reflection on what you thought about the conversation, you can continue to do so on the chat. Otherwise, have a good afternoon if you're in Nairobi like myself. If you're in Central Africa or Southern Africa, it's a little bit earlier. You might be needing your mid-afternoon coffee. I understand it's very cold in South Africa, so you need to take care of yourself and your warmth. If you're joining from West Africa or elsewhere in the world, Have a good day, morning, evening, whatever the case may be. And as we say in Kiswahili, asanteni sana.
Asante sana, Christine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.